Now, let's look at the journal entry for manufacturing costs in process costing system. So when we accumulate the cost of material, labor, and overhead, it will be the same as job order costing. When we purchase raw materials on account, we're going to debit raw material inventory and credit account payable. Um, if we incur factory labor, then we will debit factory labor and credit factory wages payable or payroll taxes payable. And for manufacturing overhead, if it's incurred, we're going to debit manufacturing overhead and credit various account, different accounts. It depends. And when we use the material, factory labor, or apply manufacturing overhead into the production process, we then use the work in process. But remember, the work in process account that we're going to use will be many for different processes. All right, so let's look at this one. If we use materials, direct materials in the production process, so we're going to debit work in process for machining. This is for direct materials. Work in process for assembly, for the direct material that we use in assembly department. And we're going to credit raw materials inventory, raw materials inventories. Okay. For example, if this company used 50,000 of direct material in machining process and 20,000 of direct material in assembly process, then we will debit work in process machining for 50,000, debit work in process assembly for 20,000, and we credit raw material inventory for 70,000. This is to record the use of raw materials in the production process. Now, next, so what about factory labor costs? We still use the time ticket for process costing system to record the time that the worker works in the factory and the rate per hour. And all the labor costs incurred within a production department are a cost of processing. So let's look at example here. Suppose that and companies incurs factory labor charges of 20,000 in machining process and $13,000 in the assembly process. The entry to assign labor costs to machining and assembly for NGG is we're going to debit work in process for machining 20,000 because we use the labor in machining 20,000. We're going to debit work in process for assembly for 13,000 and we're going to credit factory labor for 30,000. This journal entry again to record the use of direct labor in the production process. What about manufacturing overhead costs? How do we record the journal entry when we apply manufacturing overhead into the production process? Okay, so we're going to do the same thing. Um, and first of all, you will need to find how much is the applied manufacturing overhead. To find the applied manufacturing overhead, you will need to take the predetermined overhead rate time with the actual activity base. Okay, actual activity base, or we call it the actual activity driver. So normally for process costing system, machine hours is the activity base. So the journal entry is that we're going to debit work in process for that department and credit manufacturing overhead. For example, for this illustration, assume that based on machine hours, that N Wheels allocates overhead of 45,000 to the machining process and $17,000 to the assembly process. And entry is to allocate overhead to two processes will be debit work in process machining 45,000 because we allocate 45,000 to machining process, and debit work in process assembly 17,000 because we apply 17,000 of manufacturing overhead to the assembly department. And finally, we credit manufacturing overhead for 62,000 for 62,000. Now, after we finish producing from one department, we would transfer the product to another department. So suppose that NGG transfer goods with a recorded cost of 87,000 from machining to assembly. NGG makes the following entry. Okay, so we will debit work in process assembly 87,000, and we're going to credit work in process machining for 87,000 because we transfer from machining to assembly department. So remember, when we transfer from one department to another department, you will credit the one that you transfer from and debit the one that you transfer to. Okay. Now, let's look at this example. Assembly department completes unit with a recorded cost of 114,000 and transfer them to the finished good warehouse. So we finish producing the products. The assembly department will transfer the finished good to the warehouse. So then we will debit finished good inventory now 114,000 and credit work in process from assembly department 114,000. Okay, and now the company sell finished good with a recorded cost of 27,000. So then we will record the journal entry by debit cost of goods sold 27,000 and credit finished good inventory 27,000. There will be another journal entry to record the price of the products like debit account receivable and credit sale revenues. Okay, so let's look at the example here. Process costing. Lee Sun Company manufactures Zibo through two processes, blending and bottling. In June, raw material use were blending 540,000, bottling 120,000. Factory labor costs were blending 360,000, bottling 150,000. Manufacturing overhead costs assigned were blending 180,000, bottling 75,000. The company transfer units completed at a cost of 570,000 in the blending department to bottling department. The bottling department transfer units completed as a cost of 330,000 to finished good. Journalize the assignment of this cost to the two processes and transfer of units as appropriate. So let's do this one. So first of all, raw material use were blending 540,000, bottling 120,000. What will be the journal entry when we use raw material in the production process for blending and bottling? We're going to debit work in process for blending 540,000, debit work in process of bottling for 120,000, and credit raw material inventory for 660,000. Next, The questions say factory labor costs were used 360,000 for blending and bottling, 150,000. So then we will debit work in process for blending, 360,000, work in process for bottling, 150,000, and credit factory labor for 510,000. And then the questions say the manufacturing overhead costs assigned were 180,000 for blending and 75,000 for bottling. So then we will debit work in process for blending 180,000, work in process for bottling 75,000, and credit manufacturing overhead for 255,000. Now, when we transfer the units to bottling department, we will debit work in process for bottling 570,000 and credit work in process for blending 570,000. And finally, when we finish producing, we will transfer from bottling to finished good inventory. So we will debit finished good inventory 330,000. This amount was given and credit work in process for bottling 330,000. Okay, thank you so much everyone.